Well, here we are. Welcome to Breaking Convention.
I'd like to start by saying how Charlotte's talk emphasizes our need to re-look at how we regulate the use of these substances. And that's why I've got involved in this otherwise rather depressing side of human society, because I think just too much unhappiness is caused worldwide through our present way of regulating and controlling drugs, which is based, sadly, on a lack of understanding as much as anything else, lack of understanding and fear. Sorry. So the question is, how did these substances, which throughout our cultural evolution have been at the root of our cultural evolution, really, in the sense that they enabled us to get a greater experience of bonding, both with each other and with nature, with healing, with the divine. They're keys to the divine. As we can see from the names they're called: flesh of the gods, sacred medicine, the divine food, wine of the soul, the sacred leaf, food of the gods. I mean, they're always associated in past cultures with the higher state of humanity, of compassion and being part of the divine. So how has this culturally stood on its head so that now they are degraded to being prohibited and in the underbelly of the criminal world? It's a kind of strange, acrobatic movement that society's taken, which I think is a great sadness, and it doesn't reflect well on our present culture. And so what I am trying to do with many other people is to think, how can we help governments and indeed the United Nations come to have a better understanding of what would be more effective ways of controlling how people approach the use of these substances. I mean, obviously there's no absolute answer, but there's a whole range of possible new approaches. In the language of drug policy, there is no use of these substances. It is misuse. Well, the fact is that maybe 10% of the population misuse substances. I think that's been the same in rats. They did an experiment with rats giving themselves cocaine, and it was found that 10 took it more, and then dropped off, whereas between 5 and 10% went on giving themselves the cocaine till they died. And so obviously there is a genetic element to it, but there are many other elements too. But basically, most people use these substances they use them, they don't misuse them. And that's something which in my years of interacting with drug policy, I've tried to get that fact over, and it was through that that the scale of harm came out. But now, so this is just, as we've had wonderful talks this morning, telling us that they can be used to aid humanity. And we also know this from other aspects of aiding humanity. One is the study of consciousness itself. They're reliable tools to alter consciousness so that in a scientific setting we can study this altered form of consciousness with normal daily consciousness, and therefore learn what are the changes and how can they be used to benefit us generally. And surely there's no more important subject in the world than human consciousness, and how might we learn more about ways of enhancing it and also treating the many, many problems like depression and addiction and compulsive disorders. I mean, they're endless, the problems we have. And with our hurried society, the problems get more and more. And we need to better the ways in which we treat them. And historically, these substances, when I say these, I mean the psychedelic substances, have been one of the best means of accelerating a healing process, because it seems to be, this is the new research I'm doing with Robert Gerhard Harris and Dave Nutt at Imperial. It shows that the gating mechanisms in the brain are have less blood delivered to them, so they gate less responsibly. And so one has a flood of stimulation which would normally be repressed from consciousness. And that is an aid when we're trying to get to repressed memories or open things up. And also it gives us a much wider perception, which in my view, and view of, I'm sure, many, many other people here, to have a wider perception can be of benefit, because no one is saying that psychedelics are necessarily what everyone wants, but as in traditional societies, if one has a few explorers of consciousness, they can bring back findings and help society generally. So how did these international conventions come into place? They're actually quite recent, and they came here almost by mistake. They started actually through opium. The British were very, very keen on tea in the 19th century, and the Chinese had a rule that they could only pay with silver, and the Brits didn't like using up all their silver to pay for this tea, and so they decided to do it through opium, which I think they got from India. And that worked very well, apart from the fact that the Chinese didn't like it. So the Brits became the biggest drug pushers, actually, in the world. Enormous warehouses of balls of opium. And it was a very profitable business, and they loved it. But the poor Chinese were getting more and more addicted and complained. And anyway, so then the Chinese workers went to San Francisco and other places, and the Americans got nervous that the Chinese opium users would seduce their women, and so they had a first law, I think it's in 1875, forbidding the Chinese to use opium. I think whites were still allowed to, but not a Chinaman. So that was the first hinting of getting legal about these substances. Then there were various conventions. The first international convention was the opium one, and that kind of got more and more worked out. And then in 1961, while actually the drug use in the world was pretty local, there were tribal people, there were countries which used it, like India used cannabis among the spiritual elements of the society. Brahmins used cannabis, and also sadhus, and opium was used among the warrior classes. And they had no word for addiction. So the use of the substance was controlled by mores, not by legal things. And they had no problem. Then the 61 convention came in, which basically prohibited the production and cultivation, trade and distribution, possession and consumption of the 4 basic leaf plants, coca, opium, and cannabis, all of which had traditional societies who had used them for millennia. And they got this signed by 73 countries, and basically this 61 convention is at the heart of our present war on drugs approach to the regulation of psychoactive substances. It was slightly built on in 1971, the Convention of Psychotropic Substances, and then it was tightened again in 1988. But the 61 is at the root of our present situation. So, since this is the 50th anniversary of the 61 Convention, I feel it's a time for us to contemplate whether one could have a more useful convention which would reflect the reality of what we've learned over those 50 years. I don't quite know why that's there. That's just a... he's a sadhu up in the mountains and probably free from police interference, but who knows? So the 61 Convention, when it was brought up, we had little groups of youth, and there were a few, what were they called in those days, not hippies, beats in New York and London and Paris who had learned about cannabis, but it was a fairly local, small use of these things, usually intellectuals and artists and traditional people, really causing no harm to anyone. And then, since the 61 Convention, this phenomenon has kind of blossomed into a major world problem at a great many different levels, basically. It's undermined public health to a most terrible degree. The law as it stands has, until recently, when countries have overcome the law, stopped harm reduction measures like providing needles to heroin addicts. Indeed, America was very fierce in fighting against countries like Vietnam and places like that, and were cutting off aid if they encouraged, as they called it, the use of heroin by allowing needle exchange. It has, in many ways, made vast unhappiness and unrest. Billions of dollars are spent trying to eradicate and incarcerate. It's put billions of dollars, I think it's 320 million, this was a few years ago, into hands of criminal cartels, which in turn is there to finance other things which could be in the hands of the government and could be used for treatment and regulation. And indeed, a major proportion of drug-related harms come from the prohibition rather than from the drugs. So the question is, what does one do about it? Here, it generated a vast criminal underworld, undermined public health, human rights, international security and development, wasted billions of pounds each year on programs of eradication and incarceration. In the world now, there are over 10 million people in jail for drug-related crimes. In Mexico, since 2006, 35,000 people have been killed within their drugs war. And what happens is when you close down, eradicate crops and close down cartels in one area, the profit margins are just too incredibly irresistible for poor people. It just has the balloon effect and it moves down the road and crops up somewhere else. I mean, it's an interesting fact that to supply the world's cocaine market, you need a country the size of Wales. So there's no chance of policing the world sufficiently so that you can eradicate the production of cocaine. And this was another statistic, that despite US and UK spending 76 billion a year fighting the Taliban and their drug operations, 90% of UK legal heroin comes from Afghanistan at the moment. And the narcotic trade is worth 4 billion a year in Afghanistan. So there are so many ways we can look at it and see that the policies aren't working. Now, it's very difficult. There are billions of dollars being spent in keeping the war on drugs going, and that's many 100,000 or millions of people's livelihood is involved in this system. And no one likes to see these big changes, and also they're very nerve-making for politicians because there is no upside to getting involved in the question of drugs, because the media blow it up, so politicians are very, very nervous until the Daily Mail thinks we should have a review of our drug policy. It's unlikely that any political party in the UK will feel secure enough to use up political goodwill. And that's why it's very important, like conferences like this, to educate people, hopefully. And we need to educate people, and a lot of the media is beginning to be more sympathetic in that the best way to help limit damage is to learn from evidence base of what has happened before and think about new health approach to drug control based on evidence. This is just another statistic. In 2009, the US had 1.6 million drug-related offences, of which 1.3 million were for drug possession alone. Over 850,000 were arrested for marijuana, most for the mere possession. And this is a showing of the discriminatory role of the law, and that's across the world, I think, that African Americans comprise 14% of regular drug users in the US, but 30% of those arrested for drug offences and 57% of those incarcerated for drug crimes. Now, obviously, they have to arrest and put to prison the odd white person too, and I'm afraid Paul Casey has fallen into that category and got his 20 years. But what we need to think is about 8 years ago when I started in this field, amazingly, although these billions of pounds were spent, dollars every year, there was no evaluation system to find out which approaches were working most satisfactorily and which were a waste of money. Now, in modern business practice, one can't imagine a business being permitted to spend billions a year and no one saying, hey, is this working or not? But for some reason, there's a blank sheet to do with drug policy. So and when I was talking with others who were talking with the UN about the need to evaluate things, they began to evaluate. And someone said, well, your evaluations are completely out of line. And the very nice man in charge of the valuation said, well, you know, it's better that we start. The trouble is, when we send out questionnaires to the country, it's usually the cleaning woman who signs it in, and it depends on whether they want to show they've got low drug use or high drug use, depending on other matters. It has very little reality on the real thing. But slowly, the evidence base is getting better over the last 8 years or so. And that's very important. And what it is showing is that the less draconian approaches, the more evidence-based health approaches are actually more successful and less expensive. And this led my kind of interface with the international drug policy world and the UN led me to an amazing fact, which was the elephant in the room. Although cannabis is 80% of all drug crime and 4.4% of the world's population, around 200 million people, are estimated by the UN to use cannabis, whereas only 1% of the world population use all other illegal drugs. The cannabis was never mentioned at international or indeed national conventions on drug policy. And it's quite an amazing fact. It sat there in the middle of the room and no one ever mentioned it. At the last UNODC meeting, 10-year review of how the last 10 years, with hundreds of billions of dollars being spent, had gone, there was no mention of cannabis other than one 5-minute hand up by a Japanese saying that we should forbid seeds for canaries because it had hemp in it. And otherwise, there was no mention. So at that point, I decided what we need was a good overview by the world's top experts of cannabis. And so I convened a commission of what is generally accepted as the 3 top drug policy analysts in the world who do work for RAND and the UN and governments. And they and 2 others did a book, it was called The Global Cannabis Commission, which turned into, oops, I don't know where we got there, which turned into a book published by Oxford University Press called Cannabis Policy, Moving Beyond Stalemate, which has actually been informative in changing opinion. Like the Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy, who in fact endorsed the book, have used cannabis instead of going to decriminalize all substances. They decided to go for decriminalization of cannabis because obviously it's the easiest one for governments to understand. It's so much on the borderline, as it's such, its harms are so low. I mean, there's almost no other substance in the world, I think, which makes a difference, which does not kill people. There are, I think now there's 1 or 2 recorded deaths from cannabis, but when one considers there's 200 million people using it by official standards every year, and it's very, very low. But of course there are harms coming from it, from the misuse of it, and that's another thing. But so it's a time for change. And then I quickly want to say about what we're aiming to do for this year, which is I'm working closely with the all-party parliamentary group for drug policy reform and for the Global Commission on Drug Policy. And we are organizing a meeting in the House of Lords in November in order to bring world leaders, particularly of countries who are interested in reform, to discuss possible other ways forward. And one piece of work the Beckley commissioned is a cost-benefit analysis of 2 possible policy options which have never had this cost-benefit before. One is the control through regulation and taxation of cannabis in the UK, i.e. regulated market, which means one could control the CBD, THC content, etc., which is a worrying element. The other is the criminalization of heroin through government-regulated treatment centers. That means that heroin addicts could go and get their heroin and hopefully carry on a normal life. But then the main thing is the commissioning of a new draft convention, which would amend the old conventions to allow individual countries, signatory countries, more freedom to explore policy options which could suit them better. This means that it would not be against the international regulations to decriminalize use, which has been shown in about 20 countries to be beneficial. Portugal is one very much on that. All the indices of heroin addiction and have fallen. Since 10 years ago, they decriminalized personal use of all substances. Then it would also allow countries the possibility to regulate control. And that is a major thing. That is what no country has yet been able to do. Holland, for 30 years, had the coffee shop where it was legal to sell to people who wanted to smoke, but it was illegal to supply the back door. I know the head policeman in Europe who is very in favor of a regulated system because he says it puts the police in an intolerable position. So the new convention would promote evidence-based policies based on scientific evidence, differentiation between different substances as done by the scale of harm, but also between different patterns of use, between use and misuse, harm reduction, i.e. one evaluates any policy to see if it's reducing harms, flexibility and cultural sensitivity, meaning that in countries like India, where they've spoken for millennia, or in Bolivia, where they chewed the coca leaf, one has to have sensitivity. India was forced to sign that in 25 years they'd make it illegal. Since then, they've had a burst of heroin problem, and the people, the government who I've talked to, are very, very unhappy. And then, of course, human rights and proportionality. Human rights meaning that we should have the basic human right of being in control of our own consciousness, so long as we are not doing harm to others or costing the state money. So we will also do a major publicity campaign, I think, if one can get the funding, or is the question, to go with the November meeting, And with the Global Commission comes many important people, like Kofi Annan is on board, and 4 former presidents, present Prime Minister at the moment of Greece, and the former Prime Minister of Switzerland, and Nobel Prize winners and writers, and we hope to gather many, many more influential world figures to show that this is not a kind of game, a kind of hippie game. It's the serious thinkers in the world recognizing the harm that these conventions are causing and suggesting not the way forward, but saying, let's look at other options. It's time to change. The war on drugs has failed. We cannot eradicate all psychoactive substances. Let's learn better how we deal with them. So, am I within my... Yes.